Well, good morning, everybody. And one thing I have to confess is these slides sort of reproduce on their own, so there are too many of them. So I'll flip through some of them rather quickly. But anyway, this is the story. And the message really is peak oil, a turning point for mankind, which I'll try and discuss in a little more detail. And I'll try to put it in a sort of historical context. In the beginning was a big bang, and the solar system came 4.6 billion years ago. And planet Earth was apparently rather special, having a molten core, a viscous mantle, hard crust, and it developed a thin skin of air and water, which became essential to life. So apparently, I gather this is not 100% sure, but it seems to be rather unique. Some people think there's similar things in some distant part of the solar system, but nobody really knows. So then, moving on to early evolution, the continents moved around on deep-seated convection currents, and mountains rose where these things collided. And then seas and lakes formed and formed a home for early life, more than 550 million years ago. And some species, such as the limpet, which you can find on the coast down here, really hasn't changed over all those years. But others, including ourselves, are rather different. But it wasn't plain sailing, because there were cataclysmic events, there were volcanic eruptions, meteor impacts, climate changes, you name it. So there were mass extinctions from time to time in this whole thing. And it poses the question I haven't put on this slide, does petroleum man face extinction too within the next few years? So that's sort of the reason for mentioning that. So human history unfolds then, and just to go through it quickly, 12,000 years ago came settled agriculture. And apparently the communities that lived in some place tended to exhaust their soil, in which case they either died out or reduced in numbers, or they went out and conquered the neighbors' lands. So this kind of settled agriculture was the beginning of conflicts and so on. And then the other interesting thing, I think, is that food has to be stored between harvests. So the lads controlling the storehouse began to exert a certain power. They could give preference to the privileged people. They could give back to the farmers less than they received. They could charge interest. They had to keep accounts. So in other words, they laid the foundations for banking. This is how this sort of structure began to arise. Then moving on, the Stone Age people used flints, and then came bronze, iron, and steel for better weapons and better tools. And this smelting required fuel. And first it came from wood and charcoal, then from coal, from surface outcrops. Gradually these surface outcrops were deepened into regular mines, and then minerals were mined in a similar way. And that led to a remarkable development. The mines flooded when they hit the water table. In fact, the end of the Roman Empire is attributed to the date on which the Rio Tinto silver mines in Spain hit the water table. Production stopped, and there wasn't any more silver to pay the troops to defend the empire. So it's a turning point, this thing. And anyway, draining the mines led to this remarkable technological progression. First a hand pump, then somebody injected steam into one pump to drive another pump. That evolved into the steam engine, and finally came the good old internal combustion engine, when they started putting the fuel directly into the cylinder. So this is the evolution that led to this use of oil. And I think that coal, followed by oil and gas, fueled this industrial age, a short span of history really, only about 250 years. And it saw the rapid expansion of industry, transport. The first automobile came onto the road around 1880. Trade, of course, and agriculture, and the first tractor plowed its field in 1907. So all this seemed to be extending, and we're all bred to believe in endless progress, but there is such a thing as an oil age. and frankly, we're about halfway through it. Exactly how far through it is open to debate, but we are approximately at the halfway point. And it's evident that the first half provided the energy for the rapid expansion of just about everything. And I think logic suggests that the second half will see a comparable contraction. And by 2050, the world oil supply will be sufficient to support no more than about half the present world population in their present style of life. So that just emphasizes the importance of this issue. But empires have waxed and waned throughout history, so there's nothing new, nothing exceptional about this sort of pattern of expansion followed by contraction. The US empire, which you could describe as the last of these things, is different from the earlier ones, I think, because it's just financial and commercial, and they don't really have responsibility for dealing with the Nigerians like the British Empire used to. So it's a bit of a different construction. So then there's this critical issue of population I've already touched on, and the population only doubled over 17 centuries from the time of Christ, and most people during those centuries, the only energy they had was their own muscles. A little bit of wind and water and firewood as well, but muscles were the main energy. And then came good old oil, and we see this explosion of population that's gone up 6 times exactly in parallel with oil. And that poses the big question mark as to how much can be supported into the future. I looked at this thing, the numbers are most unreliable, but I think the picture is valid enough. This looks at the UK population based on energy supply. And I suppose around 1800 you could say that it was sustainable, living on whatever the farmers in England could produce. And then you had a little bit of what I call slave man, that is the benefit from the empire, whether they were slaves or employees is beside the point, but you had a little growth coming from there. And then we had coal man, and the peak of coal production was in 1914. I hadn't realized that earlier. So we see this surge of population based on coal, and then came good old petroleum man, and there's a little bit of nuclear and wind and renewables and so on that don't make much difference. So I think if you project things in a fairly reasonable way, the population of Britain would about halve by the end of this century. It's a difficult thing to say, and one doesn't know if it's true or not, but the logic is there anyway. So I give you a little course in petroleum geology just for 2 minutes so that you have a better grasp for what all this is about. And just to give some credentials, this is a picture of myself exploring for oil in Colombia in 1950 years ago. And we hear so much about modern technology and how brilliant it's become, but I have to tell you the rocks are the same. And much of the world's oil was found by nothing more than a hammer, a hand lens, and a notebook, and a mule to explore the Andes of South America. I'll just go on briefly to show you what I was doing as an example of how this sort of exploration business works. So that's the Andes there, and the Andes was made up of 10,000 meters of Cretaceous and tertiary sands and clays that had been laid down in a deep trough, which were then uplifted to form the mountains. We were doing fieldwork in the Andes where we could see these rocks and begin to understand the underlying geology. And what one needs to find an oil field is one needs a source of oil. It's very special conditions in the past when oil was actually formed. We need a reservoir to hold it. That's a porous rocks, mainly sandstones. A trap, a structural trap in which to catch it, and a seal over the top to stop it escaping. So that we're looking for places that have this unique combination of conditions. And years before then, Shell had dragged a rig up the Orinoco and had poked a hole in the east of this thing just to see what was there. And they had found good reservoir, but nothing else. We were looking in the mountains, and we found everything except the structures were too deformed in the mountains to be any good. So it took no great skill of this young man on a mule to say, well, if you look in the foothills and just in front of them, everything comes together perfectly. And then, of course, we fell in with the famous economists, and they said, why the hell are you looking for oil in the interior of South America? Wouldn't it be much better to find it by the coast? We could export it. And so the famous company listens to economists more than geologists and said, well, you're absolutely right. So they didn't pursue this. And 25 years later, I've forgotten the name of the company, Amarada, I think it was, plucked up courage to drill in the right place and fell into a major new oil province, in fact, the largest onshore oil province in the Western Hemisphere since the Second World War. And I worked for BP in those days, and finally, 20 years later, BP had to buy its way back in. So I'm just, the message out of this is finding oil is not so difficult if you look in the right place, and there are not so many of them left. So just a little bit more about the background of what oil is. And most of the world's oil came from just two brief epochs of global warming, 90 and 150 million years ago of climate, global warming that allowed this algae from which it comes to proliferate enormously. And you can, if you are here, you can go to Lochain just down the road, and you can find a comparable rift, and in the summer, the hot water rises to the top, cold water settles to the bottom, there's no circulation, and any organic material in this place just goes stagnant and fetid and corrodes away. So that's the origin of oil. And then most of the world's oil occurs in these rifts that opened when the continents moved apart. You have a rift like here, and this organic goop fell to the bottom of these rifts where it was stagnant conditions. And then when it was buried to about 2,000 meters by other sediment that was washed in, it was converted to oil, and it began to migrate upwards to collect in reservoirs and traps as possible. Some of it escaped at the surface, and that's the tar sands of Canada and Venezuela, for example. And now we hear so much about this fracking, and what that is, they're now poking holes into these miserable rocks near the source rock, where you can still find little sort of pods of oil here and there. And at the $100 a barrel, it's viable. And there's, of course, a lot of it, but it's an entirely different thing from the traditional oil we used years ago. And this just to give you an idea of what a reservoir is like, because it's made up of grains of sand, and between the sand, the spaces which oil can communicate, can flow into and collect. There are all sorts of constrictions, so it doesn't necessarily flow easily. And then the water underneath rises and gradually puts pressure on this, which can escape up a well if you poke a hole into it. And there are many different kinds of reservoirs. Some are good, some are bad, some are, you can picture this could all be blocked up with clay and seeps out a little bit. So that's the sort of background, and this is a picture of Northwest Europe, and the green area here is where oil was generated. That's the prime source. If you're in the dark green and you can find the other conditions, you're home and dry if you've got an oil well. The light green is sort of getting a bit near the edge, and then there are subsidiary other things, minor little oil source rocks in the lower Jurassic and other times, one of which lies here off the south of Ireland. I might mention the Corrib gas field we hear so much about. This actually is derived from coal, not oil, so it's an entirely different thing. In fact, it's the same as the gas fields of northern Holland and the southern North Sea, which also come from this deeply buried coal that was gasified on heating. That just shows you how these continents move around a bit, and that's what the planet looked like 150 million years ago when this oil was formed. And you can see where the North Sea was just when the opening of the North Atlantic was beginning. So that's your little lesson in petroleum geology. Talk a bit about depletion now. And I think oil and gas drives the modern world, but they're most definitely finite resources formed in the past, which means they're subject to depletion. That's a fundamental aspect that nobody can really deny. And therefore, for every gallon used, there's one less left, is a simple way to put it. And the status of depletion is extremely difficult to determine because of it's unreliable data, which is distorted for all sorts of political and commercial reasons. So it's extremely difficult to get a valid picture of this thing, but some kind of efforts can be made. And this is the golden concept of 2 centuries of Murphy's Stout at Bunratty Inn in Skull. And you can see in 1900 the glass was full. End of this century it's just about empty. And the other significant thing is the quicker we drink it, the quicker it's gone. And that applies equally to oil and this whole economic thing that we're living in. They learn to drink it quicker, which means the future gets less and less. So I'll just go into this question of unreliable data. There are 2 main distortions. First of all, the oil companies, or the major oil companies in particular, tended to underreport because they were subject to very strict stock exchange rules about what they could report. It had to be commercially in production and all of those things. There was nothing evil or crooked about it. It was just to be sure that what they were reporting was genuine. Actually, they came to like this situation because they could report the minimum that they needed to report for financial reasons, and then that, since they underreported what they had, next year they could report more, and this gave a beautiful picture of economic growth that the stock market just loved. So that was good. And then OPEC exaggerated at a time of low oil prices. I'll show that in a minute. And the official institutions have difficulty in coming to terms with this, but they are finally coming clean a little bit. I know the IEA, for example, was fully aware of all of this 20 years ago, but the political pressures were such they couldn't come out and say it. So just to explain that a little bit more, this is an example of the Prudhoe Bay field in Alaska, which you know probably. And internally, BP in 1977, who was the operator of this field, estimated it had 12.5 to 15 billion barrels. And this is the production record. And you can see the decline has set in. And if you extrapolate the decline, it'll make about 12 to 15 things. So they've used every kind of technology. They've done everything possible, but it hasn't made any material difference to the original forecast. But although they thought it had 12.5 to 15, they only reported 9 to the stock market back at the beginning. And that was reasonable because it was in a remote place in Alaska, miles from anywhere. Production depended on oil price. There were many question marks. And so they were not cheating or anything, but this cautious reporting is illustrated and is very significant when you try to establish what the true position is. Then this is the OPEC cheating. In 1970, Kuwait reported 67 billion barrels of reserves, and that had fallen to 64 by 1984. And reported reserves was what production quota was based upon. So the more your reserves, the more you could produce. That was the arrangements of OPEC. And then in the mid-80s, there was the oil prices that were collapsed and so on. And so Kuwait needed some more money, so they said, well, let's crank up the reserves. So they jumped from 64 to 90. Nothing changed in the oil fields. Nothing happened. It was simply to get more quota to make more money. And then by 87, it had fallen it had risen to 92, and that might have been a genuine new discovery they had made. But this just blew the fuse of the other lads, and Abu Dhabi said, if you are 92, so are we. Up from 31. Iran looked down its nose and said, Christ, we're better than you, aren't we? 93. Poor old Saddam, he said, well, to hell with you two, I'm 100, aren't I? Up from 47. And then the Sauds were in a spot because they couldn't match Kuwait because they were already reporting more. So they did it for another couple of years and then had their massive increase, 167 to 258, to hold their position in OPEC. And Venezuela, from its point, it also faced this thing, but this jump from 25 to 56, that reflected, including all this heavy oil stuff that had not qualified as reserves under the OPEC rules before. So in fact, they actually had the amount, if not more, but it wasn't qualified as an OPEC reserve in the early days. So you can just see the scale of the confusion over some of the world's largest producers. So if this is the mess you're looking at, it explains why this whole subject is so confused. And the green lines at the bottom is my best guess of what the real numbers are. And I stress in the case of Venezuela, that does not include all this heavy stuff, so that's a bit misleading. So we have to thank a director of Exxon, who I think, without the permission of his board, published the true numbers. And we have this picture of discovery over years, and we can see that the world peak of discovery was in the 60s, and it's been declining ever since. And in 1981, we started using more oil than we found in new fields. So that was a turning point. And obviously, you've got to find oil before you can produce it, so after the peak of discovery has to deliver in due course a peak of production, and I think we're about there. There's an argument we'll go into in a moment, but it's either just past or it's just coming. It can't be sure. With all of these unreliable data, nobody truly knows. So that's the picture. It takes no great feat of imagination to extrapolate what might be found in the future. Just extrapolating this long 40-year decline is not an unreasonable thing to do. Sure, again, you've got this problem of what you're measuring, conventional, non-conventional, and so on. And that's just another illustrating thing. This is Norway is one of the few countries that does publish genuine information. So if you plot discovery, the cumulative discovery against cumulative exploration, you get a trend like this. The big fields are found first because they're too big to miss, so that's obvious. And you get this flattening trend as they find smaller and smaller ones. So it's no feat of imagination to extrapolate this trend out to get an idea of what they will produce ever. Of course, there can always be the odd surprise. In fact, there was a late surprise recently in Norway. So this isn't a straight line, there are odd little spikes and so on, but more or less in the general picture, you can hardly deny that trend. So if we try to put it all together, we get something like this. The green is what I call regular conventional. It's supplied most in the past, and I think dominates most supply into the future. Then we have the black thing here is the heavy oils. The resource in the ground is enormous, of course, but extraction is slow and costly and a bit environmentally damaging. And you can include with the heavy oils all this fracking business we hear about today. So something like that, what it does, it ameliorates the decline, but it doesn't have much of impact on the peak itself. Then we have the deep water, that's more than 500 meters of water. Again, there's no shortage of deep water, but there's very few deep water areas that actually have the right geology, and the depletion profile is different for all commercial and technical reasons and so on. So there's a bit of a surge from the deep water, but that too will decline, and the end when it comes is a fairly steep one, I think. Then we have the polar shown here in white. This is a bit of an unknown. I've personally drilled wells in the Barents Sea off North Norway, so I know a little bit about the geology. And I think it's not a very prolific place for oil. The reason being that the Earth's crust has gone up and down under the weight of fluctuating ice caps. And so the rocks you now see at a depth of about 2,000 meters were previously at 4,000 meters. That means that the oil source rocks have mainly been pressed too deep to give oil, but they can give a lot of gas. So I think it's a gassy province, but there can always be the sort of fluke circumstance where you find something. Then we have ordinary gas. It depletes a bit of a different pattern. I won't go into that here. Then we have non-conventional gases from all coal bed methane, again from fracking and so on and so on. And then we have gas liquids underneath. And gas liquids, by the way, only give as much energy as 66% as oil. So you've got to reduce the amount by that. So that pattern now, I think that's valid, and as you said earlier, the IMF finally comes to accept. The IMF has just come out with a report which compares this model with the establishment ones by the IEA and so on, and it gives equal weight to this one versus the more optimistic ones. And I think the significance of this is enormous, because they come to recognize peak oil, never mind arguing exactly what date it is, but that there should be one followed by decline is a critical turning point, because, as we all know, the whole economy and everybody is running on this oil stuff, so the impact is just colossal, not least for the IMF, I suspect. So, well, I just said all that. Financial crash, we might... Chris is going to talk about the strange stuff called money, so I better not say much about this. But as far as I understand it, which isn't much, I think money in sort of essence should do no more than facilitate barter, as somebody exchanges work for product or potatoes for a glass of Murphy's, whatever it might be. So that's it. And it strikes me, therefore, that money supply should wither away in parallel with energy supply. But this is not easy for politicians to do, because the whole political ethic and everything is built on expansion and growth and all those things. So you've got the political aspect, which I expect Chris will mention too, that really makes it difficult for people to recognize the truth. And then this stock market, as far as I can judge anyway, is an artificial constraint. In earlier days, investors used to invest in specific projects which they knew about, they had loyalty towards, they were committed to these particular projects. But then these investments were traded on the market by the traders, who naturally could have little knowledge about the investment itself and no loyalty towards it, so they were buying and selling in a trader's fashion. So I don't have much faith in the stock market. So looking at this, and I'm very much out of my depth on all of this, but it seems to me the causes of the recent crash were the banks were lending more than they had on deposit, assuming that tomorrow's growth was collateral for today's debt, but they failed to see that growth depends on growing cheap oil-based energy to make it all possible. In fact, it was very short-term behavior, which I think is endemic to the way that operates. So, in short, peak oil means debt goes bad. So, and this also occurred to me recently, that since oil is such a critical driver of the modern economy, perhaps that is a yardstick of these things called GDP and so on, that is a good measure of the status of the economy. And it struck me that oil price stood at $20 a barrel in 1950, and it's now gone up 5 times. And I ask, does this really mean that it hasn't gone up in price 5 times, but the dollar has devalued by a comparable amount? I don't know much about that, and that's just a sort of thought. So oil price, I could say a few words about this. Oil prices firmed after 2005, roughly, which was the peak of this regular conventional oil. And I don't think there's much dispute about that the regular conventional, as so defined, has already peaked. And the shortfall came from costly non-conventional sources. And I guess the traders saw a rising trend, and there's nothing they like more than that. And they bought futures, and the industry must have seen the rising trend too, so they said, let's keep the tank full. So these two factors drove the price up and price up. And then they weren't stupid. They could say, okay, we've more or less reached the limit when it got to 100 and nearly 150 in 2008. So they said, okay, lads, let's sell short on the futures market. So that then, and this high price prompted a recession that reduced demand, and prices fell back down to 2005 levels. Since when, the governments have been printing more phony money out of thin air, not representing anything, to stimulate consumerism and restore prosperity. Demand has risen again, and we have prices today around 150, but around 120, I mean. But I suspect that this is also short-lived because the supply barrier will again be breached. So that just shows it graphically. And personally, I would imagine, one hears some people suggest oil prices are going to go through the ceiling in the future as this problem bites in earnest, but I suspect that prices, higher prices, prompt recession, curb demand, so maybe something in the range of 100 to 150 is what it'll end up doing. So just to say a few words about the ominous recent events. We've had turmoil in North Africa and the Middle East, which I don't think is likely to be resolved too soon. And now Iran is threatened. And these events are not a nice environment to produce more oil. So if they have a revolution somewhere else, it'll probably interrupt supply. And if there's a certain sort of vicious circle, because the higher the price of oil, the higher the cost of living, the more resentful people are, the more riots and more revolutions that break out. And we've already had rather exceptional riots in London and Moscow and even Wall Street. And Libya was one of the countries that faced all this, and we can ask, why did Britain and France intercede in a military fashion? And that cartoon, I think, answers that rather nicely, as they obviously concerned about Libya's oil and gas supply, which is so critical to Europe. Nobody minds if the Sudanese are fighting each other or what sort of problem here, but in the case of Libya, they had to intervene. So we see also a shift in the political response just in these last few weeks. This capitalism means economic expansion, that's what drives capitalism. But socialism speaks rather of greater equality and better sharing of what you have. And I'm always reminded of, I can even remember it, wartime conditions in Britain during the war, when the main mission of people in those days was to share reasonably and fairly whatever resources they had. And there were a few sharp people around in those days called spivs, and they were sort of condemned as morally corrupt and so on. You were not supposed to make a sharp buck on some sort of special situation you got into. You're supposed to be fair and reasonable. And you had a kind of centralized government that people respected somehow. So maybe that's the sort of conditions that will have to return. End up now. Have I overrun my time? Ireland's position, just say a few words about Ireland finally. The bad news for Ireland, little indigenous coal, oil or gas. By all means encourage exploration, but the worst thing to do would be to rely on success. They've already drilled more than 150 exploration wells looking for the stuff, and generally speaking, the results have been very poor. There's this recent so-called discovery of Barrymow, I think it's called, Barrymow, of Cork here, which got the headlines. But this thing was found in the 70s. This recent well is the fifth or sixth drilled into it. And at $100 a barrel, and it's a miserable sort of waxy crude, at $100 a barrel, it becomes viable, which it wasn't in the 70s. So this is not a new discovery. This was already known for many years. So by all means, look, there may be always freaks someplace, so if you can find somebody else to pay for looking, by all means. Electricity supply is very vulnerable. 50% is generated from imported gas, and we are very much at the end of the line from ever more distant sources in Siberia and the Middle East, and I don't think they're about to switch the lights out in Whitehall to keep Skibbereen lit up. So we just happen to be at the end of the line here. The good news for Ireland then is a small population, half that supported before the famine of 1840, plenty of green fields, plenty of scope to tap energy from tides, waves, winds and biofuels, a little bit of turf left. Solar heat can make a useful difference for domestic purposes. And oil demand is really very small on a world scale, because there's not many people here. So new policies for Ireland, let's think of something that they should do. First, they should follow the President of Portugal, whose parliament has passed a resolution urging its government to adopt the oil depletion protocol. That is to say, to voluntarily or to organize to reduce the consumption of Portugal to match world depletion rate, and gradually to get other countries around the world to follow this principle, which would keep oil prices down. Which would make it possible for the poor countries to have a little bit of something, and it would lead to better planning for the future. So one thing Ireland could do would be to follow this precedent already set in Portugal and to try to promote it. And obviously the whole world won't join such a thing, but the countries who follow this principle will themselves benefit by consuming less. And then the next step is to find out what the depletion rate is. Don't rely on this old codger in Ballydehob. Send the Irish Foreign Service out to get valid information from around the world. And don't rely on the official things, although, as I say, the IEA begins to come clear. Anyway, so if they find out what the truth is, that would make it easier to react in a sensible way. Then the sensible way involves reducing waste, and I think one useful step would be to remove energy as a charge against corporate taxable income, which is a oblique subsidy. And if the management faced the costs head on, they would move to greater efficiency. You know, when the executives pay themselves, Lord Brown of BP paid himself £5 million a year salary or something, and what really was this? This was taken as a charge against taxable income. So who actually paid it? The taxpayer. I remember when I was running an oil company, we were buying champagne and having parties and everything, charging it all as a... Norway had an 80% marginal tax rate. So every expense, 80% of it, was paid by the taxpayer. So, good time. So the next step was have graduated tariffs so that the more you use, the more it costs per unit. Of course, encourage better insulation and energy audits, public transport, bicycle and car share, 100-mile diet and more allotment so people grow their own food. And you could even have a tradable ration of some sort. That idea has been proposed. And another thing is bring in renewables from, there's no shortage of tides and waves and winds, anaerobic digestion. And I think this idea of the interconnector that's being mooted to export electricity from renewable sources is a mistake. Why subsidize some competitor with cheap energy? Better to keep it here so that international companies establish themselves here rather than somewhere else. And then make a special deal for supply from Norway, which it owns half of Europe's remaining oil and gas and is very well disposed towards Ireland. So something could be arranged. It's not a doomsday message, but I think the transition will be tough. We could picture a new benign age that would follow, and I think we need more localism. Let Munster run more of its own affairs with a local currency and banks who are actually honest, which would be a new development. Local markets, and you could picture local communities such as we already have in Ballydehob who would be smiling and cooperative. The Celtic fox can thrive in Ireland, the tiger belongs to the zoo. Thank you.